He was a decorated combat veteran, sleeping in the woods with a Purple Heart in his pocket and shrapnel still buried in his leg. But when a winter storm drove him into an abandoned military bunker hidden beneath the Carolina pines, what Marcus Holloway found inside would force him to choose between survival and honor, between $300 million in forgotten government assets and the oath he swore when he first put on the uniform. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The November wind cut through the Carolina woods like a blade, sharp and merciless, stripping the last leaves from the oak trees and sending them spiraling into the darkness. Marcus Holloway pulled his olive-drab jacket tighter, but the fabric was so thin now, so worn from years of weather and wear, that it barely made a difference. The cold found every gap, every tear, every weakness, and burrowed into his bones like it belonged there. He limped through the underbrush, his left leg dragging slightly with each step, the pain a constant throb that radiated from his thigh down to his ankle. Shrapnel, the doctors at Walter Reed had told him 8 years ago. Too deep to remove safely. You'll live with it. They'd said it like it was nothing, like living with metal fragments slowly working their way through muscle and nerve tissue was just an inconvenience, a minor footnote to his service record. Marcus was 41 years old, but felt 70. His face, weathered and lined beyond his years, told the story of too many nights sleeping rough, too many meals skipped, too many battles fought inside his own head. His dark hair, now streaked with premature grey, hung past his collar in tangles. His beard, untrimmed for months, hid a jaw that had once been strong and proud, but now just seemed tired. He'd been living in these woods outside Fort Bracken, North Carolina, for 9 months. Not the active part of the base, but the forgotten section, the acreage that had been decommissioned in the early 2000s when budget cuts forced the military to consolidate. Out here, nature had reclaimed what was once parade grounds and temporary barracks. The forest had swallowed the roads. Vines covered the old foundations. Most people in town had forgotten this land had ever been military property. But Marcus remembered. He'd trained here 22 years ago, a kid fresh out of Tennessee with nothing but dreams of serving something bigger than himself. Back then, he'd been Private Marcus Holloway, 18 years old, lean and hungry, ready to prove himself. Now he was just Marcus, no rank, no unit, no home. His camp sat near a dried-up creek bed, tucked behind a stand of pines that provided some shelter from the wind. It wasn't much, just a tarp strung between trees, a sleeping bag that had lost most of its insulation, and a backpack containing everything he owned. 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, socks with holes in them, a water bottle, a can opener, his discharge papers folded and refolded until the creases had worn thin, and the Purple Heart in its blue case. He'd thought about pawning that medal more times than he could count. Other vets at the VA clinic, back when he still went, had told him collectors would pay good money. Especially with the paperwork, a guy named Ray had said, shaking his head. Man, you're sitting on at least $500 there, maybe more. But Marcus couldn't do it. That medal wasn't his to sell. It belonged to Jimmy, who'd been standing right next to him when the IED went off in Kandahar. It belonged to the 8 years he'd given to the army, to the brotherhood he'd found in uniform, to the version of himself who'd believed serving his country meant something. Selling it felt like admitting that all of it, all the sacrifice, all the pain, all the loss, had been for nothing. So he kept it, and he stayed hungry. The storm was coming. Marcus could feel it in his leg, in the way the old wounds ached deeper, sharper, when the barometric pressure dropped. He'd heard the forecast on the radio at the gas station where he sometimes bought coffee when he had $1 or $2 from collecting cans. Major system moving in, the weatherman had said cheerfully, like it was exciting news. Heavy rain, possible sleet, temperatures dropping into the 20s. Marcus needed better shelter than his tarp. He needed it fast. He moved through the woods with the practiced silence of a soldier, even after all these years. His boots, held together with duct tape and prayers, barely made a sound on the carpet of dead leaves. He knew these woods like he knew the scars on his own body, every game trail, every old foundation, every place where the forest still bore traces of its military past. The sky had turned the color of iron, heavy and threatening. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and stinging. Marcus quickened his pace as much as his leg would allow, heading deeper into the forgotten section of the old base. There had to be something, some structure still standing, some place with a roof that would keep him dry. That's when he saw it. At first, it looked like nothing, just a mound of earth covered in kudzu and wild grapevines. But something about the shape was wrong, too regular, too geometric. Marcus stopped, his soldier's instincts kicking in. He pushed through the undergrowth, thorns catching on his jacket, and found himself standing in front of a concrete wall. The structure was massive, easily 15 feet high, covered in decades of vegetation. But there, barely visible through the vines, was a door. Heavy steel, rusted orange and brown, but still intact. Above it, in faded stenciled letters, he could just make out U.S. Army installation, authorized personnel only. Marcus's heart rate picked up for the first time in months. He'd explored most of this forest, but he'd never found this. How had he missed it? The rain was falling harder now, soaking through his thin jacket, plastering his hair to his skull. Thunder rumbled in the distance. He needed to get inside. Marcus grabbed the door handle, a thick bar of rusted metal, and pulled. Nothing. The door was sealed tight, rust and years of settled earth holding it closed like concrete. He pulled again, harder, putting his weight into it despite the screaming protest from his leg. Still nothing. The rain was coming down in sheets now, visibility dropping, the temperature falling with each gust of wind. Desperation gave him strength. Marcus found a fallen branch, thick as his forearm, and wedged it behind the door handle, using it as a lever. The metal groaned, something cracked, and then, with a shriek of protesting steel that echoed through the storm, the door lurched open 6 inches. Marcus dropped the branch, grabbed the edge of the door with both hands, and hauled with everything he had. The door swung wide, and a blast of stale air rushed out, dry and cold and untouched for decades. The smell hit him immediately. Concrete dust, old metal, and something else. Something preserved, like opening a tomb. Marcus stood at the threshold, rain pounding on his back, and stared into absolute darkness. His hand went to the small flashlight in his pocket, the one he'd shoplifted from a Dollar General 3 months ago. The batteries were dying, but they still had a little life left. He clicked it on, and the weak beam cut through the darkness, revealing a metal staircase leading down into the earth. The walls were concrete, solid and intact. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was no water damage, no decay. This place had been sealed, preserved like a time capsule. Marcus hesitated for just a moment. Every horror movie he'd ever seen told him not to go into the mysterious underground bunker. But the storm was raging behind him, and he was already soaked through, his teeth starting to chatter. Besides, he'd seen real horrors. He'd lived through them. Whatever was down there couldn't be worse than the memories that haunted him every night. He stepped through the doorway and began to descend. The stairs were steep, maybe 30 steps down, each one solid beneath his feet. The temperature dropped as he went deeper, but at least he was out of the wind and rain. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, catching glimpses of old military signage, arrows pointing to different sections, words like communications, storage, command center, and medical. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus found himself in a corridor. It stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. The concrete floor was smooth and clean under its blanket of dust. To his right, he could see doors, some open, some closed. Everything was painted that industrial green-grey color the military loved, now faded to something ghostly. Marcus turned right and moved forward cautiously. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each sound seeming impossibly loud. The first room he came to had an open door. He shone his light inside and found himself looking at what must have been a communications center. Old equipment lined the walls, radios, switchboards, things he couldn't identify. Everything was covered in dust, frozen in time. He backed out and continued down the corridor. The next room was larger, some kind of common area or meeting room. Metal chairs were stacked in the corner. A table sat in the center, and on it, Marcus saw something that made him stop cold. Coffee cups. 4 of them, sitting on the table like someone had just gotten up and walked away. They were covered in dust, but they were still there, still upright. Beside them, a yellowed newspaper, the date barely visible. November 15th, 1978. 1978. This place had been sealed for 47 years. Marcus's mind raced. Why would they seal it like this? Why not clear it out, remove the equipment, decommission it properly? The military didn't just forget about places like this. There were protocols, procedures, manifests. Everything had a chain of custody. Unless something went wrong, unless something fell through the cracks. He moved on, his curiosity now stronger than his exhaustion. The next section of corridor opened into a larger space, some kind of barracks area. Metal bunk frames lined the walls, 8 on each side. The mattresses were gone, but everything else remained. Footlockers at the end of each bunk, shelves on the walls, even personal items. A faded photograph was tacked to one wall, soldiers in Vietnam-era uniforms, smiling at the camera. Marcus stood there for a long moment, looking at those faces. Men who'd served, who'd probably trained at Fort Bracken, who'd been part of whatever this installation was. Where were they now? Did they even remember this place existed? The storm raged above ground, but down here everything was silent and still. Marcus found a corner of the barracks that looked relatively clean and set his backpack down. He could spend the night here, wait out the storm, then figure out what to do next. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't be able to rest. Not yet. Not until he understood what this place was. He picked up his flashlight and kept exploring. The corridor continued deeper into the facility, branching off in multiple directions. Marcus chose the main passage, following signs that pointed towards something labeled primary storage. He passed a kitchen area, the industrial stoves and refrigerators long since disconnected but still present. He passed what looked like a small medical bay, exam tables and cabinets full of ancient expired medical supplies. And then the corridor ended at a door, but this wasn't like the other doors. This one was massive, steel, maybe 8 inches thick. It was a vault door, the kind you'd see in a bank but military grade. The metal was brushed steel, untouched by rust, and across its face were stenciled words in faded yellow paint. Emergency Reserve Asset Storage, Authorized Personnel, Only Security Protocol, Alpha 7 U.S. Army Installation Command Classified. Marcus stood in front of that door, his flashlight beam playing across the yellow letters, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just an abandoned installation. This was something else, something important, something someone had wanted to protect. His hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and touched the cold steel. The vault door had a complex combination lock, spinning dials with numbers and letters, far more sophisticated than anything Marcus had encountered in his years of service. Below the main lock, he noticed a smaller panel, a secondary access point with a keyhole. But it was the words on the door that held his attention. Emergency Reserve Asset Storage. Emergency Reserve. Assets. Storage. Marcus had heard stories during his time in the army, late-night conversations in the barracks, rumors passed from soldier to soldier. Stories about Cold War caches, secret facilities where the government had hidden money, gold, supplies, things that would be needed to rebuild if nuclear war destroyed everything. Most guys thought they were myths, ghost stories, the kind of legends that grew in the telling. But standing in front of this vault door, deep underground, in a facility that had been sealed and forgotten for nearly 50 years, Marcus began to wonder if those stories might be true. His heart was pounding now, blood rushing in his ears. He ran his hand along the edge of the door, feeling for any weakness, any gap. Nothing. It was sealed tight, engineered to withstand anything. He couldn't get in, not without the combination or some kind of key, but that didn't stop him from wondering what was inside. Marcus backed away from the door slowly, his mind spinning. He needed to think, needed to process what he'd found. This wasn't just shelter from a storm. This was something bigger, something that could change everything. He returned to the barracks area, spread out his sleeping bag in the corner, and sat down with his back against the wall. His flashlight was dimming now, the batteries finally giving up, so he turned it off to conserve what little power remained. The darkness was absolute, a kind of darkness he'd only experienced underground. In that darkness, Marcus's thoughts turned inward. What was he going to do? If there really were assets behind that vault door, if this was a forgotten Cold War cache, then he'd stumbled onto something the government had lost track of, something that might be worth money, maybe a lot of money. He thought about the past 9 months in these woods, the nights so cold he couldn't sleep, just shivered until dawn. The days spent walking miles to the nearest gas station bathroom just to wash his face. The hunger that had become so constant he barely noticed it anymore. The way people looked at him in town, that mix of pity and disgust, like he was something broken, something less than human. He thought about the VA, about the months he'd spent trying to get the benefits he'd been promised, about the paperwork that kept getting lost, the appointments that got cancelled, the caseworkers who changed every few weeks so no one ever knew his full story, about the doctor who'd told him his PTSD wasn't service-connected because he couldn't prove the firefight he'd been in was officially documented, about the final rejection letter that had pushed him from his crappy apartment into his truck, and then from his truck, when it broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it, into these woods. He thought about Jimmy, about the moment before the IED. They'd been joking about something stupid. He couldn't even remember what now. And then the world had turned into fire and noise and pain. And when Marcus had come to, when the ringing in his ears had subsided enough to hear anything, Jimmy was gone. Not wounded. Gone. There hadn't been enough left to save. Marcus pulled the Purple Heart from his pocket, held it in the darkness where he couldn't see it but could feel its weight. He'd earned this medal in that moment, in that blast, with Jimmy's blood on his uniform and metal fragments tearing through his leg. The army had given him this, and then, when he needed them most, had abandoned him like yesterday's trash. What did he owe them? What did he owe a government that had used him up and thrown him away? The questions swirled in his mind as the storm raged above and sleep refused to come. Somewhere beyond the walls of this bunker, beyond that vault door with its yellow letters and government seals, was an answer. Maybe salvation, maybe temptation, maybe both. But Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life had just changed. He'd come down into this bunker looking for shelter from a storm. What he'd found was a test, a choice waiting to be made. And as his exhausted body finally began to drift towards sleep, as the adrenaline faded and the cold settled into his bones, Marcus Holloway had no idea which way he would choose. He only knew that tomorrow, when he figured out how to open that vault door, he would discover whether he was still the man who'd earned that Purple Heart, or if the system that broke him had destroyed everything he'd once believed in. The darkness wrapped around him like a blanket, offering no answers, only questions. And somewhere in the depths of the facility, that vault door waited, silent and patient, guarding secrets that had been forgotten by everyone except the Earth itself. Marcus woke to absolute silence. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, and panic seized his chest the way it always did when he woke in unfamiliar places. His hand went instinctively to his leg, to the place where the shrapnel lived, and the sharp pain that greeted his touch brought reality crashing back. The bunker, the vault door, the storm. He sat up slowly, every muscle in his body protesting. Sleeping on concrete, even with the thin padding of his worn sleeping bag, had left him stiff and aching. He fumbled for his flashlight, pressed the button, and was rewarded with a weak, flickering beam that told him the batteries were on their last breath. The barracks area looked different in the dying light, less eerie and more sad. This had been someone's home once, soldiers who'd pulled shifts down here, living in this underground tomb for weeks or months at a time. Marcus stood and limped to the corridor, his legs screaming at him after a night without movement. The storm had passed. He could feel it somehow, the way the air pressure had changed, the absence of that bone-deep vibration that came from thunder rolling across the earth above. But Marcus didn't head for the exit. Instead, he turned toward the back of the facility, toward that vault door with its yellow lettering and impossible promises. He stood in front of it again, studying it in the weak flashlight beam. The combination lock was military-grade, something he'd seen before in his years of service. It was a Mosler, he realized, the same company that made the locks for nuclear silos and classified document storage. 12 digits, astronomical odds of guessing correctly. But there was that secondary panel, smaller, older. Marcus crouched down, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg, and examined it more carefully. The panel was secured with 4 screws, rusted but still intact. The keyhole beneath was brass, tarnished green with age. He'd seen systems like this before. The memory came flooding back, unbidden from his 3rd deployment. They'd been clearing a forward operating base that was being shut down, and his unit had been responsible for securing the communications equipment. His sergeant, a lifer named Patterson who'd been in since the first Gulf War, had shown him the backup systems. "Everything the Army builds has redundancies, Holloway," Patterson had said, his weathered face serious. "Main system fails. There's always a backup, and the backup to the backup is usually something simple, something mechanical that can't fail. A key, a manual override, something an authorized person can access if the technology craps out." Marcus stood and began searching the facility with new purpose. If there was a key, it would be somewhere an authorized person could access it, but not somewhere obvious, somewhere secure but accessible in an emergency. He started with the office spaces he'd passed the night before. The first room was empty, except for a desk and filing cabinets, all locked. Marcus used a piece of broken metal from the corridor to pry open the drawers. Most were empty, cleared out decades ago. But in the bottom drawer of the second cabinet, beneath a water-stained folder of requisition forms from 1977, he found something. A metal box about the size of a cigar case, with a combination lock of its own. But this lock was simple, just 3 digits. Marcus sat at the desk and held the box in his hands, thinking. 3 digits. A code that someone would need to remember, but that wasn't so obvious anyone could guess it. He thought about military culture, about the numbers that mattered. He tried 111, nothing. 1776, nothing. 911, nothing. Then he remembered something Patterson had told him once during a late-night guard shift when they were both exhausted and talking just to stay awake. "You know what date every soldier should know, Holloway? The day the Army was founded. June 14th, 1775. That's our birthday. That's when it all started." Marcus tried 614. The lock clicked open. Inside the box was a key, brass and old, with a tag attached by a fraying string. The tag read, "Emergency Access, Vault Secondary, Installation Commander Authorization Only." Marcus's hands shook as he held it. This was real. This was actually real. He limped back to the vault as fast as his leg would allow, his heart hammering in his chest. The secondary panel had a small slot beside the keyhole, and Marcus realized it was for the screws. He needed to remove them first. It took 20 minutes of work with his pocket knife, the only tool he had. The screws were rusted, fighting him every turn, and twice he nearly stripped the heads completely. But finally, the last screw came free, and the panel swung open on hinges he hadn't noticed. Behind it was a simple mechanism, elegant in its straightforward design. A keyhole connected to a series of gears and levers. Marcus inserted the key, said a silent prayer to whatever god might be listening, and turned. Something deep within the door clicked. Not the main lock, but something else, something foundational. A bypass, Marcus realized. The key had disengaged a secondary locking mechanism, probably something that kept the vault sealed even if someone somehow got the combination right without authorization. But the main lock still held the door closed. Marcus stood and faced the combination dial, 12 positions marked with numbers and letters. He closed his eyes and thought back to his training, to everything Patterson had taught him, to the way the military mind worked. Numbers weren't random. They couldn't be, because people had to remember them. And in the military, especially during the Cold War, the numbers that mattered were dates. Historical dates, dates that every soldier, every officer, every installation commander would know. He started with the obvious ones. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. He dialed carefully, 12071941. The dial moved smoothly under his fingers, but when he tried to turn the handle, nothing happened. Wrong. He tried June 6th, 1944. D-Day, 06061944. Nothing. July 4th, 1776, 07041776. Nothing. Marcus's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. He cursed, pulled out his lighter, the cheap plastic one he used for the cigarettes he could rarely afford, and flicked it on. The tiny flame barely illuminated the dial, but it was enough. He thought about the date on the newspaper he'd seen. November 15th, 1978. This place had been sealed then, or shortly after. What was happening in November 1978? What would have been on the mind of whoever locked this vault? Then it hit him. The Cold War was escalating. The Soviet Union was flexing its muscles, and the army, paranoid and prepared, would have been thinking about the last time they'd faced down an existential threat. The last time victory had mattered more than anything. September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day. Victory over Japan. The end of World War II. Marcus's fingers trembled as he dialed 09021945. The lock mechanism engaged with a sound like thunder in the silence. Gears turned, tumblers fell into place, and Marcus heard something he'd only heard once before, on a tour of the Federal Reserve during basic training, the sound of a vault unsealing. The massive door hissed slightly as pressure equalized. Then, with a groan of metal that hadn't moved in 47 years, it swung slowly inward. The smell that rushed out was overwhelming. Paper, metal, and something else, the unmistakable smell of money. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his lighter held high, and stared into darkness that seemed to pulse with possibility. He stepped inside, and his tiny flame caught the edge of something that made his breath stop. Pallets, dozens of them, stacked floor to ceiling along every wall, and on each pallet, wrapped in plastic, secured with bands marked with federal seals, were bundles. Marcus moved to the nearest stack, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the lighter. He pulled back the plastic wrapping on one bundle and saw what he'd known, what he'd feared, what he'd hoped he would see. Cash. $100 bills, crisp and new, in sequential serial numbers, each bundle labeled with Federal Reserve markings and a date, 1977. The bills had never been circulated, never been spent, just sealed in plastic and stored down here like they were waiting for the end of the world. He grabbed another bundle, then another, confirming what he was seeing. Every pallet he could reach held the same thing, stacks upon stacks of $100 bills, all new, all dated from the mid to late 1970s. But that wasn't all. Marcus moved deeper into the vault, his lighter flame dancing, and found another section. Here the pallets held something different. Metal. He picked up one bar, felt its weight, saw the stamping on its surface. U.S. Treasury, fine gold, 400 troy ounces, 1976. Gold bars, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Marcus set the bar down carefully, his mind reeling. He moved to another section and found boxes labeled Bearer Bonds, U.S. Treasury. Another section held what looked like rare coins in protective cases. Yet another held silver bars, platinum, precious metals he couldn't even identify. On the far wall, mounted on a clipboard that hung from a nail, was a document. Marcus held his lighter close and read the title. Final Inventory and Asset Certification. Operation Continuity. Installation 7, December 31st, 1978. His eyes scanned down the page, taking in the numbers, the categories, the totals, and at the bottom, in neat handwriting, a final sum that made his legs go weak. Total asset value. Estimated $300,375,000. Status: secure and sealed. Next scheduled inspection, January 15th, 1980. Installation. Commander, Colonel R. Morrison. $300 million. $300 million in cash, gold, bonds, and precious metals sitting in an underground vault that had been forgotten for nearly 50 years. Marcus sank to his knees on the concrete floor, the lighter still burning in his shaking hand. $300 million. More money than he could comprehend, more money than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes, more money than existed in his entire understanding of wealth. And it had been here all along, buried under the woods where he'd been sleeping, starving, freezing, while he'd been scraping together dollars for coffee, while he'd been choosing between eating and buying new socks, while he'd been sleeping in the rain with a tarp over his head. $300 million had been sitting right here, forgotten. The lighter burned his thumb, and he dropped it. The flame went out, plunging him back into darkness. And in that darkness, Marcus Holloway felt something break inside him. Not a clean break, but something jagged and sharp, something that had been cracking for years and finally gave way. He'd served his country for 8 years. He'd given them his health, his sanity, his future. He'd watched his brothers die. He'd taken shrapnel meant for others. He'd done everything they'd asked, everything they'd ordered, everything he'd sworn to do, and they'd thrown him away. Medical discharge with partial benefits, a disability rating that was an insult, a VA system that had lost his paperwork, denied his claims, treated him like he was lying, like his pain wasn't real, like his service didn't matter. And now, here in this darkness, he'd found their money. $300 million they'd been too incompetent, too careless, too bureaucratic to keep track of. Marcus fumbled for his lighter, flicked it back on, and looked around the vault again. Nobody knew this was here. The installation had been closed, the land sold off, the records lost or destroyed. This vault, this fortune, had fallen through every crack in the system. He could take it, all of it, fill his backpack, come back night after night, move it somewhere safe, disappear to another state, another life, become someone else. Get his leg fixed, get a place to live, get his life back. Who would know? Who would care? What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus spent the next hour searching the vault systematically, his lighter flame revealing more and more of what had been hidden. In one corner, he found filing cabinets, and in those cabinets he found answers. The documents were marked classified and top secret, though time and abandonment had stripped those designations of any real meaning. Marcus pulled out folder after folder, reading by the weak light of his dying lighter, and began to understand what this place really was. Operation Continuity, a Cold War program designed to ensure the survival of the American government and economy in the event of nuclear war. Starting in the 1950s and continuing through the 1980s, the military had established secret caches across the country, underground facilities stocked with everything needed to rebuild: money, gold, medical supplies, communications equipment, even seeds and tools. The theory was simple and terrifying. If the bombs fell, if Washington was destroyed, if the banking system collapsed, these caches would provide the resources needed for continuity of government. Regional commanders could access them, use the assets to establish order, pay soldiers, buy supplies, rebuild civilization from the ashes. Marcus found a memo dated October 1978, addressed to the installation commander. It outlined the protocols. The facility was to be inspected quarterly, inventories verified, security maintained. Any discrepancies were to be reported immediately to CENTCOM. But then he found another document, this one dated February 1979, a base closure notification. Fort Bracken was being downsized due to budget constraints. Multiple installations would be decommissioned, their assets redistributed, their land sold, and then nothing. No transfer orders for the vault contents. No documentation of asset relocation. Just a gap in the paperwork, a bureaucratic black hole where this entire facility had simply disappeared. Marcus pieced it together from fragments across multiple folders. The installation commander, Colonel Morrison, had died suddenly in January 1979, just weeks after sealing this vault. A heart attack, according to the death certificate Marcus found. The base closure had begun immediately after, thrown into chaos by the sudden loss of leadership. In the confusion, with personnel being reassigned, with buildings being mothballed, with land being parceled off and sold, this facility had been overlooked. The above-ground entrance, probably a separate building, had been demolished. The underground section, already hidden and classified, had simply been forgotten. Someone had probably meant to come back for it. Someone had probably filed a memo, started a process, initiated a transfer. But that someone had been reassigned or retired or died, and the memo had been lost, and the process had stalled, and the transfer had never happened. And so this vault, with its $300 million, had sat here for 47 years, waiting for someone to remember it existed. But no one ever had. Until Marcus, stumbling through the woods in a storm, had literally fallen into it by accident. Marcus sat on the floor of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine, and felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. The lighter had finally died, but he didn't need it anymore. He knew what was in here. He knew what it meant. The right thing to do was obvious, wasn't it? This was government property. It belonged to the Treasury, to the taxpayers, to the country. He should report it, call someone, contact the authorities, let them know what he'd found. But the bitter voice in his head, the one that had been growing louder with every month in these woods, asked a simple question. Why? Why should he do the right thing when the right thing had never been done for him? Why should he honor his commitment to a government that had broken its commitment to him? Why should he care about what belonged to the taxpayers when those same taxpayers walked past him on the street like he was invisible? He thought about the last 9 months, the cold nights, the hunger, the pain, the humiliation of being denied benefits he'd earned. The caseworker who'd told him his PTSD claim was denied because not every bad experience qualifies as trauma. He thought about Jimmy, about holding his friend's dog tags because there was nothing else left to hold. About the promise he'd made at the funeral, standing in the rain, that Jimmy's sacrifice would mean something. But what had it meant? What had any of it meant? Marcus pulled the Purple Heart from his pocket held it in the darkness where he couldn't see it. He knew every detail by heart. The gold heart with Washington's profile, the purple ribbon, the words for military merit. Merit. He'd had merit once. He'd been a good soldier, a reliable soldier. He'd followed orders, supported his brothers, completed his missions. He'd earned that medal not because he'd wanted to, but because he'd done what needed to be done when everything had gone to hell. And that's what this was, wasn't it? Everything going to hell. His life, his future, his hope, all of it gone. This vault was his one chance to fix it, to take back what had been taken from him, to make things right on his own terms. He could take enough to start over, get a truck, drive to another state, find an apartment, get his leg properly treated, maybe go to school, learn a trade, build something resembling a normal life. The government wouldn't miss it. They'd already forgotten it existed. What was a few $100,000 from a cache of 300 million? But even as he thought it, even as he imagined filling his backpack with bundles of hundreds, walking out of here and never coming back, another part of him resisted. A deeper part, the part that had made him a good soldier, the part that still carried that purple heart every day. Because taking that money, even a little of it, wouldn't just be theft. It would be surrender. It would be admitting that the system had won, that they'd broken him so completely he'd become exactly what they thought he was, someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who'd take what wasn't his, someone without honor. Marcus stood slowly, his leg protesting, and felt his way out of the vault. He needed air, needed space, needed to think without being surrounded by all that money, all that temptation, all that possibility. He made his way through the dark corridor by memory and touch, back to the barracks where his meager possessions waited. His backpack, his sleeping bag, his 2 shirts and worn jeans. Everything he owned in the world, all of it worth maybe $50 at a pawn shop. $50 versus 300 million. The math wasn't even close. But as Marcus sat in the darkness of that underground barracks, in a facility that had been forgotten by everyone except the earth itself, he realized the math didn't matter, because this wasn't about money. It was about who he was. It was about whether Marcus Holloway, decorated combat veteran, Purple Heart recipient, was still the man who'd earned that decoration, or if that man had died in the woods along with everything else. He thought about his father, who'd served in Vietnam, and had told him once, over beers on a fishing trip when Marcus was 17, "Son, there's going to come a day when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. The easy choice will always be there, always available, always tempting. But the right choice, that's the one that defines you. That's the one you've got to live with every day after." His father had been dead for 6 years now. Heart attack, probably brought on by the Agent Orange exposure he'd gotten in the jungle and the VA had spent decades denying. He'd died still fighting for benefits, still trying to get the government to acknowledge what they'd done to him. What would his father tell him to do now? What would Jimmy tell him? Marcus pulled out his phone, the cheap prepaid one that barely worked, and stared at its dark screen. He had maybe $1 worth of minutes left on it. He could use those minutes to call someone, to report what he'd found, to do the right thing. Or he could save those minutes, walk out of here with his backpack full of cash, and never look back. The choice sat in front of him, stark and unavoidable. And as the hours passed and dawn began to break somewhere above ground, Marcus Holloway realized he already knew what he was going to do. He'd known from the moment he'd seen that vault door. He just hadn't wanted to admit it to himself, because doing the right thing was going to cost him everything. And taking the wrong path, the easy path, would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was trapped between 2 futures, one where he was rich but forever corrupted, and one where he was still poor but could look himself in the mirror. One where he had money but no honor, and one where he had honor but nothing else. Marcus stood and limped back to the vault one more time, He stood in the doorway, looking into the darkness where $300 million waited, and made his choice. Marcus stood at the threshold of the vault, his silhouette barely visible in the weak grey light filtering down from the entrance above. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, frozen between two futures that couldn't coexist. Finally, he stepped inside. His hands shook as he moved to the nearest pallet, the one he'd examined first, where the bundles of $100 bills lay wrapped in plastic like they'd been waiting just for him. He picked up one bundle, felt its weight in his hands. $10,000, enough to change his immediate circumstances completely. He tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he picked up another bundle, and another. 3 bundles total, $30,000. Enough for a motel room, real food, maybe a doctor to look at his leg. Enough to think clearly for the first time in months without hunger and cold clouding every decision. Just $30,000 from $300 million. The government wouldn't miss it. They'd forgotten the entire vault existed. This wasn't stealing, Marcus told himself. This was survival. But even as he zipped his jacket over the bundles, even as he turned to leave the vault, guilt twisted in his stomach like broken glass. Because he knew the difference between survival and theft, and $30,000 was already crossing that line. He sealed the vault door behind him, watching it swing shut with that final, heavy click. The combination automatically re-engaged. If he left now, if he walked away, he might never be able to get back in. The emergency key had only bypassed the secondary lock, not opened the primary. Marcus climbed the stairs toward daylight, each step feeling heavier than the last, despite his pockets being full of money. The storm had passed completely, leaving the world outside scrubbed clean and bright. The sun hurt his eyes after so many hours in darkness. He stood at the bunker entrance, breathing fresh air that somehow didn't feel as good as it should, and looked down at his jacket where $30,000 sat hidden against his chest. It felt like it was burning through the fabric, marking him, branding him as something he'd never been before. A thief. Marcus walked back to his camp by the dried creek bed. His tarp was soaked through, his sleeping bag waterlogged from where the storm had gotten to it. Everything he owned was wet and cold, but now he could afford to replace it all. He could afford a motel room with a real bed, a hot shower, a door that locked. He packed his few belongings into his backpack, rolled up the wet sleeping bag, and started walking toward town. It was 6 miles, and his legs screamed at him with every step, but for once he barely noticed the pain. His mind was too loud, too full of competing voices, all arguing about what he'd just done. One voice said he'd earned this. 8 years of service, a Purple Heart, a medical discharge that had stolen his future. The government owed him more than $30,000. They owed him a lifetime of care they'd promised and never delivered. Another voice, quieter but persistent, reminded him of the oath he'd taken, of the man he'd been, of the principles that had made him a good soldier, a reliable soldier, someone his brothers could count on. Marcus reached the edge of Fort Bracken just after 10 in the morning. The town was even sadder in daylight. Boarded-up shops, cracked sidewalks, faded American flags hanging limp from porches. This place had been dying since the base closure, and it showed in every peeling paint job, every empty storefront, every resident who looked like they'd given up decades ago. He walked to the motel on the edge of town, a sagging 2-story building with a flickering neon sign that read "Vacancy," whether rooms were available or not. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass was a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and cigarette-stained fingers. "One night," Marcus said, sliding a $100 bill through the slot. His first bill from the vault, marked with serial numbers from 1977, crisp and new like it had been printed yesterday. The woman looked at the bill, then at Marcus, then back at the bill. "Where'd you get this?" "Does it matter?" Marcus asked, his heart suddenly racing. "It's legal currency." She held it up to the light, checking for counterfeits. Finally, she shrugged and rang it up, handing him $82 in change and a key card. Room 14, upstairs, end of the hall, checkouts at 11. Marcus climbed the exterior stairs, his leg protesting every step, and let himself into a room that smelled like bleach and desperation. But it had a bed, a real bed with sheets and a pillow. It had a bathroom with a shower. It had heat. He locked the door, dropped his backpack, and stood in the middle of the room, suddenly unsure what to do. He'd been dreaming of a moment like this for months, a hot shower, a warm room, safety. But now that he had it, all he could think about was the vault, the money, the choice he'd made, and the bigger choice still waiting. Marcus pulled the bundles from his jacket and laid them on the bed. 3 stacks of hundreds, each wrapped in federal bands marked with treasury seals. $90,000, he realized, not 30. He'd grabbed 3 bundles of 10,000 each, but each bundle had multiple layers. He counted them carefully, his hands shaking. $90,000. 3 months of living expenses, maybe 6 if he was careful. More money than he'd seen in his entire life, sitting on a stained motel bedspread like it belonged there. He stripped off his filthy clothes and stepped into the shower, turning the water as hot as it would go. Steam filled the small bathroom, and Marcus stood under the spray, watching months of dirt and shame swirl down the drain. The hot water stung the sores on his feet, the infected scratches on his arms, the constant ache in his leg. He scrubbed himself with the tiny bar of soap until his skin was raw, like he could wash away the decision he'd made, the theft he'd committed, the line he'd crossed. But even as he stood there, clean for the first time in weeks, he felt dirtier than ever. Marcus wrapped himself in the thin motel towel and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the money. He picked up his phone, the prepaid one with less than $1 of minutes remaining, and held it in his hands. He could call someone, report what he'd found, do the right thing even now, even after taking the money. He could return it, claim he'd only taken it for safekeeping, say he was going to report it anyway. But who would believe him? Who would believe that a homeless veteran had found a vault full of $300 million and only taken $90,000? They'd think he'd taken more and hidden it. They'd arrest him, interrogate him, throw him in prison while they sorted it out. Or worse, they wouldn't believe him at all. They'd think he was crazy, suffering from PTSD-induced delusions. They'd commit him to a VA psych ward where he'd rot while the vault sat undiscovered, forgotten again for another 50 years. Marcus lay back on the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He hadn't slept properly in days, hadn't felt safe enough to really rest. But now, in this locked room with money in his pocket and heat in the air, his body surrendered to sleep before his mind could argue. He dreamed of Kandahar. The dream was always the same, had been for 8 years. He was walking down a dusty street, the sun beating down like a hammer. Jimmy was beside him, making some joke about the terrible coffee they'd had that morning. Marcus was laughing, and then Jimmy was saying something else, something important, but Marcus couldn't quite hear it over the noise. What noise? There wasn't any noise. And then the world turned white and red and loud, so loud it deleted all other sound, all other thought. Marcus was flying or falling or both. The ground slammed into his back, driving the air from his lungs. His ears rang like church bells. Someone was screaming. He tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't work right. He looked down and saw blood, so much blood, and metal shards sticking out of his thigh like strange flowers. Someone grabbed him, started dragging him. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see their mouths moving, their eyes wide with fear. Where was Jimmy? Marcus turned his head, searching, and saw something that made his mind shut down completely. Not Jimmy, not anymore. Just pieces. Just evidence that Jimmy had been there moments ago, had been alive and joking and talking about coffee. In the dream, Marcus tried to crawl toward what was left of his friend, but hands held him back, pulled him away, loaded him onto a stretcher. He fought them, screaming Jimmy's name, but no sound came out. The world was silent except for that ringing, that endless, eternal ringing. And then someone was putting something in his hand, pressing it into his palm. Jimmy's dog tags, warm from his skin, covered in dust and blood, the last piece of him that was still whole. Marcus woke up gasping, his heart hammering, his leg on fire with phantom pain. The motel room was dark. Hours had passed. He fumbled for the lamp, knocked it over, finally found the switch. Light flooded the room, harsh and real, chasing away the dream but not the feeling. His hands were shaking. Sweat soaked the sheets despite the cool air. This was the PTSD the VA had said wasn't service-connected. The nightmares they'd claimed he couldn't prove were real. Marcus sat up, pressing his palms against his eyes. Jimmy's dog tags were back at his camp, or had been before the storm. He'd kept them for 8 years, carried them every day, until the night he'd gotten so drunk he'd almost thrown them in a river because the weight of them was crushing him. He'd kept the Purple Heart instead. The medal sat now in his jacket pocket, mixed with $90,000 in stolen money, the symbol of his honor resting against evidence of his dishonor. Marcus stood and walked to the window, pulled back the stained curtain, and looked out at the parking lot below. A few cars, all of them old and beaten. The neon sign flickered, buzzing in the night. Beyond the motel, the town was dark and quiet, dying slowly like a patient everyone had stopped trying to save. He thought about the oath he'd taken when he'd enlisted. He'd been 18 years old, standing in that recruiting office in Tennessee, his father beside him because he wasn't old enough to sign the papers alone. The recruiter, a staff sergeant with kind eyes and a chest full of ribbons, had walked him through it. "Raise your right hand," the sergeant had said, and Marcus had complied, his palms sweating, his heart racing with excitement and fear. "I, Marcus Holloway, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me, according to regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So help me God." True faith and allegiance. Those were the words that stuck with him now. Not the part about obeying orders, not the part about the president or officers, the part about faith and allegiance, about being true. Could you be true while living a lie? Could you have faith while acting faithlessly? Could you swear allegiance while stealing from the very institution you'd pledged to serve? Marcus turned away from the window and looked at the money on the bed. $90,000. More than he'd earned in 2 years of combat pay. Enough to change his life, to give him a chance, to provide the help the government had promised and failed to deliver. But it wasn't his. No matter how much he needed it, no matter how much he'd earned it through suffering, no matter how much the government had failed him, it wasn't his to take. His father's voice echoed in his memory. The easy choice will always be there, always available, always tempting, but the right choice, that's the one that defines you. Marcus sat back on the bed and picked up his phone. He had less than $1 in minutes remaining, but it would be enough for one call. The question was, who should he call? Not the police. They'd think he was crazy or trying to run a scam, not the VA. They'd barely returned his calls when he was trying to get benefits. They certainly wouldn't believe a story about $300 million in a forgotten vault. He needed someone who understood veterans, someone who would listen without immediate judgment, someone who could verify his story before the government showed up and made everything worse. And then Marcus remembered Sarah Mitchell. He'd met her 9 months ago, right after he'd first become homeless. She ran a veterans outreach program in the next town over, had tried to help him get into housing, had offered counseling and job training. He'd told her to leave him alone, had said some things he regretted now, had walked out of her office and never gone back. But she'd given him her card, and he'd kept it, tucked into his wallet between his expired driver's license and his DD-214 discharge papers. He'd kept it because even in his anger and pride, some part of him had known he might need help someday. Marcus pulled out his wallet, found the card. It was creased and worn, but the number was still legible. And beneath her office number, she'd written something else. Cell. Call any time, day or night. He looked at the clock, 2:37 in the morning, but she'd said any time. Marcus dialed, listening to his remaining minutes tick away with each ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe she'd forgotten him or... "This is Sarah," a sleepy voice answered. "Who's this?" "It's Marcus Holloway," he said, his voice rough. "We met 9 months ago. I told you to shove your help where the sun doesn't shine." There was a pause. Then, "Marcus, yeah, I remember you. Are you okay? Where are you?" I'm at a motel in Fort Bracken. Sarah, I found something big, something impossible, and I don't know what to do." "Slow down," she said, and he could hear her moving, sitting up. "What did you find?" Marcus took a breath. A bunker. An old military bunker from the Cold War, sealed since 1978. And inside it, there's a vault full of money and gold. $300 million worth, according to the inventory. It's been forgotten, lost, sitting there for almost 50 years. Silence, long silence. "Sarah?" "Marcus," she said carefully, "have you been taking anything? Any substances that might—" "I'm not high. I'm not crazy. I'm not making this up." He was gripping the phone so hard his knuckles hurt. "I can prove it. I have documents. I have—" He looked at the money on the bed. "I have some of the cash. I took some. Not a lot, but enough to get a room tonight to think clearly." "You took money from this vault?" Her voice had changed, become more alert, more concerned. $90,000. I know it was wrong. I know I shouldn't have. But Sarah, I've been living in the woods for 9 months. I'm in pain every day. I'm hungry. I'm cold. I found $300 million and I needed to breathe for one night. To think without my legs screaming and my stomach eating itself." Another pause. Okay, Marcus. I believe you. Or at least, I believe you believe it. Where's this bunker?" Marcus told her, describing the location in the woods, the entrance, the vault, everything. As he talked, he could hear her moving, getting dressed maybe, definitely writing things down. "Marcus," she said when he finished, "I need you to do something for me. Can you do that?" "What?" "Stay in that motel room. Don't go back to the bunker. Don't touch anything else. Don't spend any more of that money. Just stay there and wait. I'm going to make some calls." "To who?" "Sarah, if you call the cops, they'll arrest me. If you call the VA, they'll commit me. I'm trusting you with this, and I need you to—" "I'm calling a friend," she interrupted. "A journalist. Someone I trust. Someone who's been covering stories about how the government treats veterans. If what you're saying is true, this is the story of the decade. But we need to do this right, or you'll end up in prison or worse." Marcus felt something in his chest loosen slightly. A journalist. Someone who could verify the story, document it, make it public before the government could bury it or bury him. "Who?" he asked. "Her name is Diana Walsh. She works for the investigative desk at a major paper. She's tough, she's fair, and she doesn't trust the government any more than you do. If anyone can help you navigate this, it's her." "And you think she'll believe me?" "I think," Sarah said, "that she'll want to see the evidence before making up her mind. Which is exactly what you need. Marcus, if this is real, if you really found what you say you found, you've stumbled onto something huge, but you need help. You can't do this alone." Marcus looked at the money on the bed, then at the Purple Heart in his jacket pocket. "I'm scared, Sarah. I'm scared they'll say I'm lying or crazy. I'm scared they'll arrest me for taking the money. I'm scared that even if they believe me, they'll make me disappear because I know about something I'm not supposed to." "That's why we're doing it this way," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We document everything first. We get the story on record. We make sure there are witnesses and evidence and paper trails. Then, when we contact the government, You're protected. You're not just some homeless vet making wild claims. You're a whistleblower with proof." The word whistleblower hung in the air. It sounded both heroic and dangerous. "Okay," Marcus finally said. "Okay, how long will it take?" "Diana lives about 2 hours away. I'll call her now, explain the situation. If she's willing, she could be there by dawn. Can you wait that long?" "Yeah, I'm not going anywhere." "Marcus, one more thing." "What?" "You did the right thing by calling. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you did. Whatever happens next, remember that." After they hung up, Marcus sat in the silence of the motel room and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if he'd finally started making things right. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat on the bed, staring at the money, at the door, at the window, waiting for either salvation or disaster to arrive. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. 3 o'clock became 4, became 5. The sky outside began to lighten from black to grey to pale blue. At 6:15, there was a knock at the door. Marcus stood, his legs stiff from sitting, and approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "Diana Walsh. Sarah Mitchell sent me." He opened the door to find 2 women standing there. Sarah, who he recognized immediately, looked tired but determined. Beside her was someone older, maybe mid-40s, with grey-streaked dark hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of face that had seen too much bullshit to be easily impressed. "Can we come in?" Diana asked. Marcus stepped aside, and they entered. Diana's eyes went immediately to the money on the bed, then to Marcus, then around the rest of the room, taking in everything. His worn clothes, his old backpack, the exhaustion written on his face. "Sarah told me your story," Diana said without preamble. "Show me the proof." Marcus handed her the documents he'd taken from the vault. The inventory sheet, the memo about Operation Continuity, the base closure notification. She read through them carefully, asking questions, checking dates, running her fingers over the paper like she could tell if they were authentic by touch. "These look real," she finally said. "Old enough, right kind of paper, correct format for military documents from that era. But documents can be forged. I need to see the actual bunker. I need to see inside that vault." "I can show you where it is," Marcus said. "But I can't get back into the vault. The door auto-locked when I closed it. I only got in the first time because I found an emergency key and figured out the combination." Diana looked at him sharply. "You figured out the combination to a military vault?" Marcus explained about Patterson, about what he'd learned in service, about the backup systems and the historical dates. As he talked, he watched Diana's expression change from skepticism to interest to something like respect. "You used your training," she said. "Your experience as a soldier to solve a problem most people wouldn't even recognize." "I just did what Patterson taught me. Military protocols aren't as complicated as they seem. They're just systematic." Diana smiled slightly. "I think you're smarter than you give yourself credit for." She turned to Sarah. "We need to move fast. If his story checks out, we need to document everything before alerting the government. Once they know, they'll lock this down tighter than Fort Knox." "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked. "Everything," Diana said. "Your story, your service record, photos of the bunker, photos of the documents, video if we can get it. And we need to figure out whether you're going to be treated as a hero or a thief when this goes public." Marcus looked at the money on the bed. "I took $90,000. That makes me a thief, doesn't it?" Diana followed his gaze. "Maybe. Or maybe it makes you a desperate veteran who made an understandable mistake in an extraordinary situation. That's going to depend on how we frame this, how we present you, and how much sympathy the public has for your circumstances." "I don't want sympathy," Marcus said. "I want to do the right thing. I want to return the money, report the vault, and not end up in prison or a psych ward." "Then that's what we'll fight for," Diana said. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. Once this story breaks, your life is going to change forever. You're going to be famous or infamous, depending on how it plays out. People will have opinions about you. The government will have questions. It's going to be overwhelming and probably scary. Scarier than Kandahar? Marcus asked. Diana met his eyes. Different kind of scary, but yeah, maybe. Are you ready for that? Marcus thought about it. Thought about living in the woods versus living in the spotlight. Thought about being invisible versus being scrutinized. Thought about the man he'd been versus the man he wanted to be. I'm ready, he said. Let's do this right. They spent the next 8 hours documenting everything. Diana photographed the money, the documents, Marcus himself. She interviewed him on camera, asking detailed questions about his service, his homelessness, finding the bunker, everything. She made him tell the story 3 times, checking for consistency, looking for holes. Then they went to the bunker. Sarah stayed in the car while Diana and Marcus hiked through the woods. When they reached the entrance, Diana stood there for a long moment, just staring at the massive concrete structure, the steel door, the faded military markings. "My God," she whispered, "it's real. It's actually real." They went inside, Diana filming everything with her phone, the corridor, the barracks, the office spaces, the preserved equipment, and finally the vault door with its yellow lettering and massive locks. "Can you open it?" Diana asked. "No," Marcus admitted, "not without the key and the combination, and I left the key inside." "Then we'll have to take your word for what's in there, at least until the government confirms it." Back at the motel, Diana made her first call. Marcus and Sarah listened as she spoke to her editor, laying out the story, arguing for resources, promising this was worth the investment. When she hung up, she was smiling. "We're green-lit, full investigative piece, front page if it pans out. Now we need to contact the government." "Who do we call?" Marcus asked. "We start with the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office. We tell them we have information about a lost military installation and we're requesting comment for a story. We don't tell them about the vault or the money until we have their initial reaction on record, okay?" Marcus nodded, his stomach churning with anxiety. Diana made the call on speakerphone. A bored-sounding press officer answered, took down the information, promised someone would call back within 48 hours. "That's not good enough," Diana said. "This is time-sensitive. We're running the story this week regardless. If you want the DoD's side included, you need to get me someone who can speak to Cold War-era installations in North Carolina by end of business today." That got their attention. Within 2 hours, Diana's phone rang. A colonel from the Pentagon asking pointed questions, demanding to know what they knew and how they knew it. Diana gave them just enough to get them moving. The location, the facility designation, the date it was sealed. She didn't mention the vault or the money, not yet. The colonel promised to send a team to investigate and asked them to keep the location confidential until it could be secured. Diana agreed, but made it clear they'd be accompanying any investigation with cameras rolling, and then they waited. The team arrived the next morning. Military police, a representative from the Treasury Department, 2 officers from the Army Corps of Engineers, and a very nervous-looking lawyer. Diana was there with her camera. Sarah was there for moral support. And Marcus stood in front of them all, prepared to face the consequences of his choice. They descended into the bunker together, the officials' flashlights cutting through the darkness Marcus had navigated alone just 2 days before. When they reached the vault door, the Treasury representative whistled low. "Operation Continuity," he murmured, reading the markings. "I've heard rumors about these, but I've never seen one intact." It took them 4 hours to get into the vault using specialized equipment Marcus didn't understand. And when the door finally swung open, when their lights illuminated the pallets of cash and gold, the room fell absolutely silent. $300 million, one of the officers finally said. "Give or take, it's all here, all accounted for according to the original inventory." The Treasury representative turned to Marcus. "And you found this how?" Marcus told his story again: the storm, the search for shelter, the discovery. When he got to the part about taking the $90,000, he pulled the bundles from his backpack and held them out. "I took this. I'm sorry. I was desperate and I made a bad choice, but I'm returning it now, all of it." The representative took the money, examining it carefully. "These are from the vault. Serial numbers match the inventory." He looked at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. "You could have taken more. You could have taken all of it, a little at a time, and no one would ever have known." "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "I could have, but that's not who I am." And in that moment, standing in a forgotten vault beneath the Carolina pines, with $300 million surrounding him and his future hanging in the balance, Marcus Holloway finally understood his father's words about the easy choice versus the right one. He'd made his choice. Now he'd have to live with the consequences, whatever they were. The official statement from the Department of Defense came 3 days after the vault was opened. It was dry, bureaucratic, and maddeningly vague. The United States government confirms the discovery of a previously unaccounted Cold War-era installation. All assets have been secured and will be returned to the Treasury. We thank the individual who reported this finding for their civic duty. That was it. No mention of Marcus by name. No acknowledgement of $300 million. No explanation of how the government had lost track of an entire facility for 47 years. Just a bland statement that made it sound like they'd found a box of old paperclips in a closet somewhere. Diana's article, published that same day, told a very different story. The headline screamed across the front page: "Homeless veteran discovers $300 million forgotten by government, returns fortune despite own desperation." Below it was a photo of Marcus standing outside the bunker entrance, his weathered face and worn clothes telling their own story. The article laid out everything: his service record, his Purple Heart, his medical discharge, the VA's failures, his 9 months living in the woods, and the impossible choice he'd faced when he found the vault. Diana had included the part about Marcus taking $90,000. She'd framed it honestly: a desperate man making an understandable mistake, then doing the harder thing by returning it. She'd interviewed other homeless veterans who said they would have done the same, or worse. She'd spoken to advocates who pointed out that $90,000 was a fraction of what Marcus was owed in benefits the VA had denied him. But most powerfully, she'd included Marcus's own words: "I took the money because I was desperate. I returned it because I'm a soldier. Soldiers don't steal, even when the system fails them, even when they're hungry and broken and forgotten. That's what honor means." The article went viral within hours. By noon, it had been shared 50,000 times on social media. By evening, every major news network was running the story. By the next morning, Marcus Holloway was the most talked-about veteran in America. The response was overwhelming and divided. Some people called him a hero, a man of principle who'd chosen honor over wealth. Others called him an idiot for not keeping the money when the government had clearly abandoned it. Still others questioned whether the whole story was real, claiming it had to be some kind of hoax or publicity stunt. But the veterans community, they understood. Within days, veteran organizations across the country were holding Marcus up as a symbol of everything right about military service and everything wrong with how the country treated its veterans afterward. Donations poured into veteran support programs. Politicians who'd ignored veteran issues for years suddenly couldn't stop talking about how much they cared. And Marcus, sitting in that same motel room because he still couldn't afford anything better, watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and terror. The phone Sarah had given him, a decent smartphone to replace his dying prepaid, rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted him as a guest. Advocacy groups wanted him as a spokesman. Movie producers wanted to option his life story. "Make it stop," Marcus said to Sarah one afternoon. his hands shaking as another call came in. "I don't want to be famous. I just wanted to do the right thing." "I know," Sarah said gently. "But Marcus, you've become something bigger than just yourself. You're a symbol now, and symbols have power. We can use that power to help other veterans, to force change in the system. You don't have to do it alone, but please don't waste this opportunity." She was right, Marcus knew, but that didn't make the attention any easier to handle. The real battle began 2 weeks after the vault was secured. The government issued a formal statement claiming ownership of all assets found in the installation. The money, the gold, the bonds, everything belonged to the Treasury and would be returned to the general fund. Marcus had expected that. What he hadn't expected was the lawyer who showed up at his motel room with a proposition. Her name was Rebecca Torres, and she specialized in finder's law, an obscure area of legal practice that dealt with lost property and the rights of those who discovered it. She was 40, sharp as a knife, and convinced Marcus had a case. "There's legal precedent for finder's rewards," she explained, spreading documents across the small motel table, "particularly for assets that have been abandoned or lost by the rightful owner. The government can claim ownership, but there's an argument to be made that you're entitled to compensation for discovering and reporting it." "How much compensation?" Marcus asked. Rebecca smiled. "That depends on several factors. The value of the property, the circumstances of the finding, the conduct of the finder. In your case, you found $300 million, reported it voluntarily despite personal hardship, and returned money you'd initially taken. Courts have awarded finder's fees ranging from 10 to 25% in similar cases." Marcus did the math in his head. 10% of $300 million was $30 million. 25% was $75 million. Numbers so large they stopped meaning anything. "I don't want to fight the government," he said quietly. "I don't want to look like I'm trying to profit from this." "Marcus," Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You earned this, not just by finding the vault, but by serving your country for 8 years, by sacrificing your health, by living in the woods while the government that owes you benefits lost track of $300 million. Taking a finder's fee isn't profiting. It's justice." "She's right," Diana said. She'd been sitting quietly in the corner, but now she spoke up. "I've been covering your story, and the public sentiment is overwhelmingly in your favor. People want you to get something for this. They're angry that the government is just taking everything back after forgetting it existed." Marcus looked at the Purple Heart sitting on the bedside table, the medal he still carried everywhere despite everything. "If I fight for this, some people will say I only reported the vault because I wanted a reward. They'll say I'm not really honorable, that I'm just like everyone else, motivated by money." "Some people will say that no matter what you do," Sarah said. "But most people will see the truth, that you're a veteran who did the right thing and deserves to be compensated for it. You can't control what everyone thinks, Marcus. You can only control what you do next." Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he looked at Rebecca. "If I did this, if we fought for a finder's fee, what would happen to the money? Would I just get it and that's that?" "It would be yours to do with as you see fit," Rebecca said. "Then let's do it. But I want one thing made clear from the start. Whatever I get, most of it goes toward helping other veterans. I'm not doing this to get rich. I'm doing it to make something good come out of all this." Rebecca smiled, the kind of smile a lawyer gets when they know they have an unbeatable case and a client with principles. "Then we have a deal. I'll work pro bono until we settle. If we win, my fee comes out of the settlement. If we lose, you owe me nothing." The legal battle that followed was brutal. The government fought hard, arguing that finder's fees didn't apply to government property, that the installation had never been truly abandoned, that Marcus had no legal claim to any compensation. They brought in lawyers from the Treasury Department, the Department of Defense, and the Attorney General's office. But Rebecca was relentless. She filed motions, cited precedents, and most effectively, she kept the case in the public eye. Every hearing, every filing, every government argument got reported by Diana and picked up by the national media. And with every article, public pressure mounted. Veterans groups organized protests outside federal buildings. Petitions circulated demanding Marcus receive compensation. Congress members, facing angry constituents, started asking pointed questions about how the government had lost track of $300 million in the first place. The legal proceedings dragged on for 4 months. 4 months during which Marcus lived in limbo, still in that motel room, still struggling day to day, but now with the weight of public attention making everything harder. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. Some people wanted to shake his hand and thank him. Others wanted to argue with him about his choices. All of it was exhausting. Diana visited regularly, checking on him, bringing food, just sitting with him when the attention became too much. They'd become friends, bonded by the shared experience of navigating this impossible situation. "How do you do it?" Marcus asked her one evening. "How do you deal with being in the public eye all the time, having people judge everything you do?" Diana laughed, a tired sound. "I don't really. I go home, I close my door, I remind myself why I do this work. It's not about me. It's about the truth, about accountability, about making things better. You're the same way, Marcus. This isn't about you wanting attention. It's about you trying to do the right thing and help others. Focus on that when it gets hard." "I keep thinking about all the other guys like me," Marcus said. "The ones still sleeping in the woods, still fighting the VA, still trying to survive. If I get money from this, I want to help them. I want to build something that actually works, that doesn't make them jump through hoops or prove they're deserving." "Then that's what you'll do," Diana said simply. The settlement came in the 5th month, sudden and unexpected. The government, facing mounting pressure and bad publicity, agreed to mediation. In a closed-door session that lasted 16 hours, Rebecca negotiated a deal. Marcus would receive a finder's reward of $10 million. $10 million. Not 30 or 75, but still more money than Marcus had ever imagined having. The government would frame it as compensating him for his service and sacrifice, not just for finding the vault. It would be tax-free, paid in a lump sum, with no strings attached. In exchange, Marcus would sign a non-disclosure agreement about certain classified details of the installation and agree not to pursue further claims. The government would also fast-track his VA benefits claims, properly rating his disability and issuing an apology for the administrative failures that had left him homeless. Rebecca called Marcus with the news at 8 in the morning. He was sitting on the motel bed, having just woken from another nightmare about Kandahar, and he wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. $10 million, she repeated. "Marcus, you won. They're cutting you a check within 30 days. Marcus sat in stunned silence. $10 million. It was more money than his parents had made in their lifetimes combined. More money than everyone in his old neighborhood had probably made combined. Enough money to never worry about anything ever again. "Marcus, are you there?" "Yeah," he managed. "I'm here. I don't know what to say." "Say yes. Say you accept the settlement." "I accept," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "And Rebecca, thank you. Thank you for believing in me." The news of the settlement broke that afternoon, and the response was again divided. Some people celebrated, saying Marcus deserved every penny. Others complained that $10 million was too much for just finding something. Financial experts debated whether it was a good deal compared to the $300 million he'd found. But Marcus didn't care about any of that, because for the first time in years he could breathe. He could plan. He could think beyond just surviving the next day. The first thing Marcus did with his money, even before the settlement was finalized, was get medical treatment. Rebecca advanced him enough from her own funds to see a proper doctor, someone who didn't work for the VA, someone who took his pain seriously. The surgeon who examined his leg was blunt. Whoever told you this shrapnel was too deep to remove was wrong or lazy or both. I can get most of it out. It'll take a couple of surgeries and months of physical therapy, but you'll have significant pain reduction. Maybe 70 to 80% improvement. Marcus had cried in that examination room, not from pain but from relief. Someone believed him. Someone could help him. He wasn't crazy, wasn't exaggerating, wasn't drug-seeking like one VA doctor had suggested. He was a man in genuine pain who could be helped. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Marcus did something else he'd needed to do for years. He started therapy. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen who specialized in veteran PTSD, didn't waste time with platitudes or dismissals. In their first session, she listened to Marcus talk about Kandahar, about Jimmy, about the guilt and grief and anger he'd been carrying. Then she said simply, "That sounds like hell. Let's figure out how to help you carry it better." For the first time since the explosion, Marcus felt like someone understood. The nightmares didn't disappear, but Dr. Chen gave him tools to manage them, ways to process the trauma instead of just enduring it. She taught him that healing wasn't about forgetting or getting over it, but about integrating his experiences into a life that could still have meaning and joy. "You've survived the war," she told him. "Now you have to survive the peace. That's often harder." Marcus also did something revolutionary. He got an apartment, a real apartment with a bedroom and a kitchen and a bathroom that didn't smell like bleach and desperation. It was nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom in a quiet building, but it had windows that let in light and a door that locked and a bed that didn't smell like cigarettes and regret. The first night he slept there, in sheets he'd bought himself, in a place that was his, Marcus wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of safety, of privacy, of home. Sarah visited him there a week after he moved in, bringing a housewarming gift, a framed copy of Diana's original article, the one that had started everything. "So you never forget," she said, "that you did something extraordinary." Marcus hung it on the wall, right next to his Purple Heart, which he'd finally had properly mounted and displayed. The two things together told his story, who he'd been and who he'd become. But Marcus knew the real work was just beginning. He had $10 million, minus Rebecca's fee and taxes, leaving him with roughly $8 million. It was more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to build something that mattered. With Sarah's help, Marcus established the Holloway Veterans Initiative, a non-profit foundation dedicated to helping homeless and at-risk veterans. The mission was simple: provide immediate, no-questions-asked assistance to any veteran who needed it. Housing, medical care, job training, mental health services, whatever it took. Marcus seeded the foundation with $5 million, keeping the rest for his own needs and emergencies. It was the largest single donation to a new veterans organization in a decade, and it made national news. "Why give away so much?" a reporter asked him at the press conference announcing the foundation. Marcus thought about those months in the woods, about every veteran he'd met in the same situation, about Jimmy who'd never made it home at all. "Because I was there," he said simply. "I know what it feels like to be forgotten, to be failed by the system that promised to take care of you. If I can help even one person avoid that, then everything I went through was worth it." The foundation's first initiative was purchasing and renovating a building to serve as transitional housing. 20 units, all fully furnished, available to veterans for up to 2 years while they got back on their feet. No rent, no rules beyond basic respect and sobriety, just a safe place to heal and rebuild. But Marcus wanted to do something else, something symbolic. He contacted the government about purchasing the bunker property. The land had been federal property, part of the old Fort Bracken installation. Marcus offered to buy it, to take on the liability and maintenance, to preserve it as part of his foundation's mission. After some negotiation, the government agreed, selling him 50 acres, including the bunker, for far less than market value. They were probably happy to be rid of the reminder of their incompetence. Marcus's vision was ambitious: turn the bunker itself into a veterans' resource center. The above-ground portion would be rebuilt, modernized, made into offices for counselors, job placement specialists, benefits advocates. The underground section, including the vault, would be preserved as a museum and educational space, a reminder of both Cold War history and the story of one veteran who'd chosen honor over fortune. The renovation took a year. Marcus was there for much of it, despite his surgeries and physical therapy, watching as the forgotten installation that had saved his life transformed into something that could save others. The grand opening was on Veterans Day, 18 months after Marcus had first stumbled into the bunker during that storm. Hundreds of people attended: veterans, supporters, politicians eager to associate themselves with the success story, and media from across the country. But the moment that mattered most to Marcus was when the first veteran walked through the doors seeking help. His name was David, 28 years old, Marine Corps, homeless for 6 months after his PTSD made it impossible to hold down a job. "I heard about this place," David said, his voice shaking. "Heard you help people like me. Is that true?" Marcus looked at this young man, saw himself 2 years earlier, saw Jimmy and all the others who'd been lost or forgotten. "Yeah," he said, his own voice thick. "That's true. Come on, let's get you sorted out." They got David into housing that day. Within a week, he was seeing a therapist. Within a month, he was enrolled in a vocational training program. Within 6 months, he had a job, an apartment, and for the first time since coming home from war, hope. David was the first, but not the last. In its first year, the Holloway Veterans Initiative helped 400 veterans. Some needed housing, others needed medical care. Still others just needed someone to listen, to believe them, to remind them they mattered. Marcus was there for all of it, not as a distant founder, but as someone who understood. He met with veterans who came through, shared his own story, listened to theirs. He advocated for them with the VA, helped them navigate the bureaucracy, used his newfound fame to pressure the system into actually serving the people it was supposed to serve. Diana documented it all, writing follow-up articles about the Foundation's work, about the lives being changed, about how one man's choice had rippled out into something larger. She and Marcus had become close friends, bonded by their shared mission of accountability and truth. "You know what the best part of this story is?" Diana said one day as they toured the renovated bunker. "It's not the $300 million or the vault or any of that. It's that you took the worst moment of your life and transformed it into meaning. You took being forgotten and used it to make sure others wouldn't be." Marcus smiled, looking around at the resource center, at the veterans receiving help, at the bunker entrance that no longer led to darkness but to light. "I had a lot of help," he said. "You, Sarah, Rebecca, all the people who believed in me. I couldn't have done this alone." "Maybe," Diana said. "But you made the first choice, the hardest one. Everything else came from that." 2 years after finding the vault, Marcus stood at the bunker entrance one evening after everyone had gone home. The sun was setting, painting the Carolina sky in shades of orange and purple. The woods around him were peaceful, alive with evening birdsong. He thought about the man he'd been, desperate and broken, stumbling through these same woods looking for shelter. That man had been lost, had given up hope, had thought his story was over. But that man had also been strong enough to do the right thing when tested, strong enough to choose honor over survival, strong enough to turn suffering into service. Marcus pulled out his Purple Heart, the medal he still carried every day. But now he also carried something else, a photo of the Foundation's first graduating class, 20 veterans who'd completed the program and moved into their own apartments, their own lives, their own futures. Both items sat in his pocket together, the past and the present, the wound and the healing. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "New vet just arrived. Says he heard your story and it saved his life. Thought you'd want to know." Marcus smiled and typed back, "On my way." He took one last look at the bunker entrance, at the place where everything had changed. The sign above the door no longer read "Authorized Personnel Only." Now it read, "Holloway Veterans Initiative. All who served are welcome here." Marcus had learned something profound in these woods, in that vault, in the choice he'd faced. He'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing your mistakes or pretending they never happened. It was about making the next right choice, and the one after that, and building something meaningful from the wreckage. He'd also learned that no one was beyond saving, not even himself. That rock bottom could be a foundation if you chose to build on it rather than sink into it. That the darkest moments could become doorways to light if you had the courage to walk through them. And most importantly, he'd learned that doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything, even when it was hard and scary and uncertain, was always worth it in the end. Because the right thing had a way of rippling outward, touching lives you'd never meet, changing things you'd never see. Marcus Holloway had been a homeless veteran with nothing but a Purple Heart and shrapnel in his leg. Now he was a man with purpose, with meaning, with the satisfaction of knowing his life mattered. Not because of the money or the fame or the recognition, but because he'd chosen honor when tested and built something beautiful from that choice. He'd found $300 million in a forgotten vault. But the real treasure had been discovering that he was still the man who'd earned that medal, still capable of service, still worthy of his own respect. And as he walked back toward the resource center, toward the veteran waiting for help, toward the work that would fill his remaining years, Marcus finally understood what his father had meant all those years ago. The right choice did define you. It defined you not just in the moment you made it, but in every moment that followed, in every life you touched, in every person you helped. Remember that they too could make the right choice when tested. Anyone can lose their way when life breaks them down. The real measure of a person isn't whether they fall, but whether they stand back up and what they choose to build from the pieces. Marcus Holloway had fallen. He'd hit bottom so hard, he'd broken open the earth and found a secret buried beneath it. And from that secret, that test, that impossible choice, he'd built something that mattered. A place where broken veterans could heal, a reminder that the system could be challenged, and proof that one person doing the right thing could change everything. The homeless veteran who'd slept in the woods was gone. In his place stood a man who'd found his way back to honor, to purpose, to himself. And in helping others find their way, he'd discovered the truth that had been waiting all along. The greatest treasure wasn't in any vault. It was in the choice to be worthy of the life you'd been given, no matter how hard that life had been. As darkness fell over the Carolina woods and lights came on in the resource center, Marcus Holloway walked through doors that now opened for him instead of closing, toward work that mattered, toward a life that had meaning. He'd found his way home, and now he was helping others find theirs. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of courage, honor, and second chances are waiting for you. Click to continue your journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that doing the right thing is always its own reward.